2 decades ago, the 6th console generation was starting to pioneer online multiplayer, with each platform producing their own games and whole franchises that offered dedicated online components. There were a lot of swings and misses, but perhaps one of the most successful yet oddly forgotten examples is Zipper Interactive's SOCOM series. Spanning 4 games on the PlayStation 2 with millions of copies sold, integrating forward-thinking technology with a highly dedicated user base made it one of Sony's most successful showcases of the PlayStation network, making it all the more odd that the SOCOM franchise has been left dormant for over a decade. This isn't the first time Sony has abandoned franchises, as Siphon Filter, Twisted Metal, Sly Cooper, Infamous, Jak and Daxter, and Killzone can attest. It isn't bad in the sense that it leads to more original IPs, except the mechanics of tactical team-based multiplayer has seen a major resurgence in the last few years, making the absence of SOCOM all the more of a missed opportunity. SOCOM's multiplayer has been shut down outside a handful of dedicated fan servers, and I don't have any history or experience regarding it, although it does look very fun. Instead, I wanted to look at the consistently sizable and feature-rich single-player campaigns and see if they hold up. After playing through the 4 games on the PS2, you can really see how the military action genre evolved through the 2000s, going from slow-paced, disconnected operations to bombastic story-driven affairs. For the initial game, story is almost non-existent. You play as a commander of a Navy SEALs fire team named Kahana, completing 12 missions split across 4 operational theaters: Alaska, Thailand, Congo, and Turkmenistan, mostly involving defeating militias, rescuing hostages, and preventing terrorists from getting nukes. This setup isn't interesting as you only have a few missions for each storyline, no characters outside your team, and the cutscenes for every level look average, even for the time. Very uncanny stuff. Unfortunately, besides the name, there really isn't any deep diving into SOCOM itself, like their history or real operations. The acronym is the only real deviation from just being like the ghosts in Ghost Recon. What is interesting is the metapolitics. Before the arsehole cynicism and misanthropy about the war on terror and all the geopolitical and moral quandaries attached itself to action games, including eventually SOCOM itself, here's a game that unironically takes itself and the subject matter as earnestly as possible. And you know what? It's quite refreshing to unironically play as good guy America versus the forces of evil, albeit not amounting to anything impactful. What was impactful is SOCOM's gameplay, not because of any sort of ambitious features or intricate level design, but its functional squad-based tactical action. Similar attempts on past console hardware were mixed at best due to severe hardware compromises. So look at Zipper managing to get large, multi-objective levels with 3 other teammates actually work on the PS2. Most of the time. The general format of each mission is like any other tactics game. You have a briefing menu where HQ outlines the situation, targets and objectives, as well as additional intel, like enemy equipment, recommended strategies, and maps that reveal the topography of the level and potential hazards. The straightforward, dramaless way info is delivered makes it so professional and clinical it's almost boring. The voice acting is pretty odd, since they occasionally use proper actors and also one-off performers, including, I think, former service members. Thankfully, it's rescued by the ability to customize your loadout for each squad member with a primary and secondary firearm and a couple special items like grenades or C4 explosives. It's a small selection of firearms, and sometimes you are practically restricted, like having to use silenced weapons to avoid detection, but they have punchy sound effects and bullet impacts on enemies, making headshots satisfying. Despite appearances, nearly every mission in SOCOM is very linear. As you have no choice on deployments and few alternate routes, you'll be directed to the levels via waypoints for each task and constant pop-up hints. Turn that shit off. The objectives themselves are appropriately Navy SEALs-like, defusing bombs, demoing supplies and facilities, rescuing hostages, and neutralizing terrorist leaders. The levels are fairly large and spread out, offering a variety of locales, including jungle bases, Arctic outposts, and cargo ships, with a series of side tasks, like scouting enemy patrols, collecting intel, and preventing alerts. Although your team is nearly exclusively facing infantry, and there is a limited number of them per mission, the average grunt is perfectly capable of killing you once exposed and overwhelmed. Compared to other contemporaries, the enemy AI is pretty good. They'll take cover, throw grenades, rush your team, and reposition when under fire. You can't always lead them out. To mitigate the scale of the opposition, SOCOM highly encourages utilizing stealth, not to ghost levels like most other titles, but infiltrate and ambush the enemy before switching to more traditional third-person combat. For most games with a veneer of realism or tactics, optional stealthing is rare, and the mechanics here are really cool. You can take cover in foliage, perform quiet takedowns, move bodies, and even shoot out light sources, which is fucking insane for the PS2's hardware. There are clear limitations here. The enemy AI errs on the side of the player by having limited response range and stunted reaction times, so you don't have to restart immediately if spotted or get into a gunfight. Hiding enemy bodies is pointless as they quickly fade out, and the linearity of the levels means you can't maintain stealth more than half the time. I would sometimes get spotted by lookouts, despite being concealed. I assume because my teammates were alerting them, or the stealth system is actually pretty spotty. Alerts themselves mostly affect the optional objectives and the end level score. Itself doesn't unlock anything for the campaign, as far as I know. This means combat is the greater focus overall, and it's made functional thanks to responsive controls and good UI. Moving your seal is like in any third-person game. You can quickly switch weapons, change stances, and go into a first-person mode, though I found the sensitivity for the movement speed too high. You can try being precise with the joysticks. Instead, I highly recommend turning on the auto-aim system, as firearms can be frustratingly inaccurate, making sniping and silent attacks much harder. The other major component of SOCOM's game design is the squad you'll lead in every mission. Made up of 3 additional teammates, they're split into Alpha and Bravo, which you command by pausing the game and selecting from a list of orders. For a console title, these are very broad. You can breach rooms using different grenade types, order in airstrikes, deploy charges, target enemies, and move to waypoints, either stealthily or combatively. Although, only with Bravo can you issue long-range move orders, as Alpha stays back as your constant wingman. Very little of it is scripted, and it's incredibly satisfying tasking different teammates and seeing them act it out in real time. The fact they can actually provide covering fire or clear the area is incredibly impressive, if not very reliable. You'll see your teammates blow themselves up, ignore enemies, or get tripped up on the environment. Fortunately, there is no permadeath for your comrades, and you only fail if they all die. It's worth mentioning that the original SOCOM included a headset, with which you could issue orders to your squad and communicate with teammates online. I don't know how effective it was, nor if it improved over successive games, but I'm mentioning it now, otherwise you'll complain about me not bringing it up. It would have added some nice replay value if you could upgrade their skills and abilities, albeit risking overbloating the campaign. It's a real shame that SOCOM stages are so basic that these mechanics can't really breathe. There's only one pathway and exit, and the game is scripted so that enemies will become alerted or spawn at certain times and places. SOCOM's presentation is also really mixed. The ordinary level geometry, muddy textures, and low draw distance makes everything look way too dark. On the other hand, there's the aforementioned light sources you can shoot out, ripples and water streams, rain effects, and nice interactable foliage that still foments a level of immersion. Zipper has a long history of really nice model animations, so the use of mocap for the seals looks great, with fluid body movement that shifts depending on your speed. Typically, this is where I'd wrap things up, a quick summary of the flaws and a recommendation. Not so much with SOCOM, as I didn't finish it. The last few missions are that fucking bullshit hard. The game isn't really difficult. If you die, it's a restart, except levels are only 10 to 15 minutes long, and there's only 12 of them, until the last 3. These are easily the hardest parts of the entire series, with the first operation having your team infiltrate and rescue an informant from a prison. Firstly, it's really hard to remain undetected. It seems to just come down to luck where the enemies are placed. Once inside the prison, you can start clearing the area before these 2 automatic grenadiers will fuck you up so fast and hard, I was just baffled when it happened the first time, and then it keeps on happening. If you do kill them before they blow you the fuck out, you then need to escort the informant to the extraction point. However, a gunship appears and obliterates what remains of your team. It's a real fucking pickle, as you have no anti-air equipment to take it down. You just have to ever so fucking carefully lean out and shoot it and not die immediately. After a couple of hours and then finding out the next 2 missions add more grenadiers and get harder, I gave up. As I've played more games, you gradually notice the tricks devs pull to lengthen their titles. Randomly giving enemies insta-kill equipment in the late game is quite transparent. That makes SOCOM 1 a decent proof of concept, but skippable, as the sequel, SOCOM 2, is a massive improvement on its predecessor in nearly every way. This is the SOCOM game that fans rightly tout as the best title, and after playing through the series, I'm in agreement. If you play one of the games, this is it. Whilst suffering its own bullshit, it's the best tactical shooter on the PS2 and one of its better action games. The single player campaign is still the main focus, with again 12 missions and 4 locales, and right out of the gate, the overall presentation is of substantially higher quality than the first game. The FMVs introduce each setting showing the villains that you'll face and have much better production quality and voice acting, often being multilingual. There's also a lot more in-game cutscenes where enemies espouse issues or pieces of intel, giving them a bit more character. It does have a slight cartoonishness. You'll see backstabbing mafia leaders and Spetsnaz assassins fitting some sort of caricature or another. Regarding your seals, you're now playing as Spectre, and there's a different voice actor for HQ. In-game, your fireteam chatters frequently, which can get annoying when replaying sections and hearing the same banter a dozen times. A small addition to the briefings are the documents you can read over beforehand, helping to outline the opposition's makeup and other miscellaneous details. I always love this extra effort that better contextualizes the environment. Zipper did a similar thing with Crimson Skies, and it's the same here. The lack of self-awareness is pretty hilarious to read, like in how Brazil is suffering from terrorism arising from its poorer sectors, not because their living conditions are facilitating radicalization, but because the terrorists themselves are bad, sociopathic people. Anyway, the levels are greatly scaled up. Now the extended draw distance allows a mix of close and long-range combat with plenty of additional objectives and alternate strategies to completing them. The maps themselves look far better, with heaps of foliage, buildings, and interiors, although this is somewhat misleading. This is primarily exclusive for the first and last handful of levels, flipping to a much more linear mid-game. It's no surprise these are my least favourite levels. There has been a few graphical redactions, such as the absence of destructible light sources. Collecting intel in the maps actually serves a purpose now, as it gives you advantages for the next stage, like enemy locations and faster bomb defusing, giving a reason to explore the area in depth. This wouldn't be implemented again. Controls have been slightly polished, with smoother sensitivity when moving, and the squad commands are still the same. There's been an expansion in the weapons available from the mission briefings, and they all sound great, with enough differences to make replaying missions worthwhile, until you realise the silenced M4 has incredible accuracy and lethality, becoming the go-to firearm. Secondary equipment is largely the same. There are now rocket and grenade launchers to deal with armoured targets in a few areas. Aside from that, it's more infantry combat. Ironically enough, you do face another gunship that only needs a mag dump from an M4 to take down. There's still a few really annoying levels, primarily a result of SOCOM 2's technical limitations. Most well known is the 4th mission, where you have to move through a favela, rescue a hostage, and capture a VIP, all while you have to protect a squad member. So it's a 3-person escort mission. Aside from the variety of ambushes, the last stretch sees a swarm of enemies assault you, where the frame rate collapses and input delay starts kicking in, making it a nightmare of repeating the same 15-minute mission again and again. After that, it mostly calms down, with a bunch of pretty simple missions, as long as you take your time and exploit choke points, like in this embassy mission. Defend multiple floors against dozens of troops, or just sit up top and kill everyone trying to enter through a door. Tough choice. However, the shit show restarts in the second last mission, where you must escort an analyst between 3 facilities. This should be fine until the game starts breaking down during close quarters encounters. Enemies will continually insta-kill you via melee attacks, damn the hitboxes. Your escortee runs off and gets killed, and everyone gets stuck and dies on the environment. It's such a shit show, and why I much prefer playing on easy, as you can't change the difficulty between levels until beating the campaign and replaying it. The game isn't hard, there's just a couple totally bullshit segments that brings down the whole experience. To my disappointment, there are minimal unlockables after finishing the game, except for multiplayer costumes and a few weapons depending on what difficulty you finished it on. On the original hardware, I'd say play on easy, then replay on the harder difficulties, as the game is fun enough for multiple playthroughs, something I rarely say of most titles. Alternatively, you can emulate SOCOM to mitigate the difficulty spikes and technical hiccups, which I can tepidly recommend as an owner of the physical copies, and that it's the only way to play the games online. When the hardware isn't handicapping the mechanics, everything functions much better, particularly your teammates. The larger levels dovetail together with your team's AI, so you can actually task them to clear whole sections of the map while you cover the rest. It's honestly awesome to see it come together in-game, realizing Zipper's vision of accessible gameplay and intuitive squad commands. After the first 2 games, I was curious to see how SOCOM games perform when emulated, and since I've talked about the 3rd game played on the console, I felt it would make for a good demonstration of what's possible with modern hardware. SOCOM 3 takes a couple of steps forward, but reductions in level design and a few mechanics walks it back as well. First off, this isn't a perfect emulation. It's not true 60 FPS or widescreen supported, and the shadowplay symbol stayed in all these recordings. God fucking damn it. Thankfully, most of these issues are simple to adjust in the PS2 emulator. You'll need to tweak things a fair bit, but having the VU option on the settings set to nearest and extra plus sign fixes the most glaring graphical issues. If you're going to use a joypad, you'll need to remap the controls for crouching and proning to separate buttons, as the lack of pressure sensitivity on peripheral controllers makes this impossible for a single button. You only need to give up the quick selecting button for it to work. Otherwise, depending on your hardware, test around and see what works. I know smarter folks will point out what I got wrong, but look, I'm a fucking casual at this, I just want a good time. The third campaign doesn't deviate much from the previous ones. However, this time it's only 3 regions instead of 4, with the first segment of the game carrying on events from the second game with about 7 missions where you break down the military ambitions and regime of a stand-in for Gaddafi or Saddam. You even raid his hideout like an Operation Red Dawn. It's so emblematic of 2005 that SOCOM would do this without a hint of irony, a real artifact of the era. The rest of the campaign is a few missions in Southeast Asia taking down a pirate gang and several levels in Poland backing up the government, making it slightly longer than the prior titles, albeit repeating a few environments. The cutscenes and dialogue are about on par with SOCOM 2, a good variety of languages, and there's less goofiness, which is important when tackling genocide and chemical weapons. The briefings don't have as much flavor text, until you notice that it's in first person and the background features your teammates talking about the mission and each other's history. This is awesome, and I completely missed it on my prior playthroughs, definitely adding texture to your squad. For the level design, SOCOM 3 doubles down on its linearity, focusing on scripted set pieces that aggressively directs the player down a certain route. Instead of optional and action components you can alternate between, there's now dedicated action and stealth levels where you might have a turret section, holding off waves of soldiers and tanks, or recon an area without any alerts. You're further supported by an even greater selection of gear. Now you can customize weapons with lasers, scopes, silencers, and tripods. This is balanced out by a weight system where your movement speed is gimped from the heavier loadout. The increased firepower and now inclusion of frequent checkpoints lessens any frustrations even on the higher difficulties. Except by reducing the player's overall freedom, the missions just aren't nearly as memorable. In SOCOM 3's defense, the stages are far longer and expansive. Levels will have you clearing multiple villages, blowing up compounds, gathering intelligence, clearing out caves, and capturing VIPs in just a single map. There's more dynamism in the objectives, with new updates and challenges that makes things less predictable. It helps SOCOM 3's single player stand out among other action titles in not being as straightforward. Not unlike Halo, the on-foot gameplay is now broken up by numerous vehicle sections including jeeps, pickups, and boats. Their controls are undemanding yet overly blocky, frequently bashing into the environment, and their armaments are entirely overpowered, removing any sense of challenge. Oddly enough, you can hop into the passenger or turret seat, worthless since your teammates can't actually drive you around, at least I couldn't get them to. You can pull off a few cool maneuvers, blocking roads, preventing enemies escaping, drifting around corners to yeet patrols. I can easily see their inclusion in the multiplayer being a lot of fun. Now for the controversial portion, because it could just be a result of me emulating the game, as I found my teammates' AI greatly reduced and fairly dumb. Partly, the lost competency is self-evident in their inability to follow waypoints like in the prior games. They'll get stuck on the environment, ignore enemies, or get caught in your explosives, failing the mission. It's a real shame, as a couple levels could offer this, but it's just not possible anymore. I think SOCOM 3's campaign would have been great if it had a cooperative element. Split-screen tactical action sounds great, and if the Conflict series, the Time Splitter games, and Star Wars Battlefront were able to do this on the PS2, it might have been feasible. This leaves SOCOM 3 as an odd game. It has plenty of quality sequences and levels that demonstrates what makes the franchise so good. However, after really appreciating SOCOM 2's mechanics when they worked, it feels like a missed opportunity here to not build upon what was established to be the best of the series. Finally, that leads us to SOCOM Combined Assault. Released in 2006, this marked the culmination of Zipper and Sony's multiplayer and cross-platform integration efforts for the franchise. Between 2005 and 2010, there were 3 SOCOM games for the PSP titled Fireteam Bravo, and while the first installment had a bit of crossover with SOCOM 3, the second game shared its story and unlockables with Combined Assault. Alongside that, the campaign was entirely playable cooperatively online with 3 other players who would take the roles of your squad mates. This would have been fucking awesome, a victory lap after years of gradual progression. unfortunately lost with the closure of the online service. This leaves behind another decent campaign that feels like it's going through the motions. I've already talked about Combined Assault before, but I might as well cover it again while you're here and see what it's like emulated. For tactical shooters, storytelling in 2006 was moving away from vignettes and disconnected scenarios and embraced focused narratives. For Combined Assault, this was being entirely set in Tajikistan, where your team is initially spent rescuing captured SEALs and an informant from a bunch of rebels. I think it's nice how they establish a team as this long-lasting crew by referencing previous operations. They still talk way too much. I don't want to listen to Jester anymore. The situation escalates with the appearance of a PMC, corrupt leaders, and all sorts of crimes, leading your team to save the country. The very optimistic view of US foreign policy reached its peak around the time before that cynicism really set in. Besides that, there's almost nothing else to draw from it, as the game design is a mixture of SOCOM 2 and 3. Missions are doled out in sets of 3, giving you the choice in what order you want them tackled, before the fourth culminative stage that continues the story. Playing levels in different orders doesn't change anything. There's no time limit for rescuing hostages or capturing VIPs, but completing side objectives for certain stages can offer benefits, like reduced enemy air or armor presence. There are 18 missions, 6 more than previously, each are generally shorter and don't always have checkpoints, and they're not that hard anyway, with new equipment like medkits, body armor, and rocket launchers. Environments are less linear than in 3. Frequently, you'll need to complete half a dozen objectives across a sprawling map, with optional stealth or combat being relevant again. I was quite impressed how they've included vehicles as a way to move quickly between objectives rather than short, action-packed interludes. Repeating SOCOM 2's openness with SOCOM 3's gameplay additions should make Combined Assault the definitive single-player campaign, except they kinda fucked it up. The squad command system has been greatly reduced. No longer can you task them to waypoints or deploy items, they can only move to your crosshair and a few other basic orders. Even then, the AI still trips up or gets caught on the environment when following you, undermining their usefulness. Of course, this could be partly due to emulation. I'm not sure. The result is that your team is relegated to just helping you kill enemies and destroy vehicles. At least that works well. Once more, I imagine completing objectives throughout the maps with 3 other friends would have been hugely fun. Strangely, the weapon range hasn't been limited and doesn't expand progressively through the campaign. There are more attachments and munition types, such as underbarrel grenade launchers that can fire smoke or gas grenades, or beanbag rounds, allowing less lethal playthroughs. Points are lost though for the inexplicable removal of blood. Enemies now keel over and instantly vanish. Actual unlocks in Combined Assault require collecting badges awarded after completing challenges in the campaign. Aside from a couple reasonable ones, like finishing a mission without using a medkit or killing anyone, they are exceedingly time consuming. Completing all the bonus objectives in the campaign is 1 badge. Playing on hard is 1 badge. Beating the game under 5 hours is 1 badge. To unlock more weapons that were already introduced in prior games, requires like 18 badges. Come on. I guess this gives it more replayability in addition to an instant action mode for maps you've already played, offering mission types like escort or recovery. It's extra content, except the lack of new weapons, loss of teammates' functionality, and blood impacts just makes the gameplay boring. Don't get me wrong, Combined Assault is not a bad game. It's just disappointing when they've truncated various solid mechanics and you can't readily access those online features, leaving the single player experience as an afterthought. That basically concludes the PlayStation 2 SOCOM games. They hold up as decent to great tactical action games, not falling victim to nostalgia bias like so many others. After the PS2, the series was humbled by the mess that was Confrontation and unsuccessfully relaunched itself in 2011's SOCOM 4. By then, the market had entirely moved away. This is captured in the same year, with Modern Warfare 3 accruing over $1 billion in 3 weeks. Now 10 years later, several of the most popular multiplayer games are tactical shooters of some sort. Evidently, the market has returned. In lieu of any reboot, I really hope the games are properly preserved beyond legally dubious emulation and niche online fan communities who deserve at least a remaster after decades of upkeeping the games on their own dime. After 4 games, totaling dozens of hours, I can recommend the SOCOM games both as solid entertainment and a legacy worth maintaining.